Everyone calls Rick Sanchez a nihilist. He says it himself, over and over, in nearly every season. Fans built entire arguments around the idea that nothing in his universe means anything to him. Dan Harmon, the man who created him, once described Rick as someone who cannot handle the void he claims to worship. In this video, breaks down every major philosophical theory built around Rick Sanchez, the smartest man in every universe. Rick and Morty started as a small show on Adult Swim back in 2013, made by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon. It followed a drunk old scientist named Rick Sanchez and his nervous teenage grandson Morty Smith as they jumped between dimensions in a flying car, using a device called a portal gun to visit worlds that ranged from silly to terrifying. On the surface, it looked like a cartoon built for laughs, full of gross jokes, weird aliens, and Rick belching mid-sentence. But within a few seasons, something strange happened. People stopped talking about the show like it was just another late-night cartoon. They started talking about Rick Sanchez like he was a thinker worth studying. Fans gave him a nickname that stuck everywhere online, the smartest man in the universe. His family treated him that way inside the show too. Morty followed him into danger without question. Beth, his daughter, admired him despite how much pain he caused her. Even his enemies across the multiverse feared him and respected his mind. But it was not just the characters inside the cartoon who started to see Rick this way. Real people outside the show began quoting his lines the way people quote philosophers. College students put his words on posters. Strangers online debated what he really believed about life, death, and whether anything mattered at all. A character built to deliver punchlines somehow became a mirror people held up to their own doubts about existence. This did not happen by accident. Rick Sanchez was written with actual philosophy underneath the jokes. Dan Harmon, one of the two people who created the show, has said in interviews that Rick is a lonely nihilist, someone who has decided that nothing in the universe carries any built-in meaning. Harmon has also said that Rick is right about half the time and wrong about half the time, even though his opinions are almost always the loudest in the room. That detail matters. It means the creator of the show never intended Rick to be treated as a flawless genius who always has the answer. He built a character who sounds certain but is often wrong, which is exactly the kind of person real philosophers have spent centuries writing about. Harmon went further in discussing one particular episode called The Old Man in the Seat, saying that Rick struggles with having any normal spiritual connection to the parts of life he cannot explain or control. That is a striking thing for a writer to say about his own main character. It suggests that underneath all the science and the multiverse jokes, Rick is a person running from something bigger than himself, something he cannot solve with a gadget or a chemical formula. A lot of real philosophy across history has come from people trying to answer that exact same problem. What do you do when you realize you cannot control the universe and you are not sure it has any purpose at all? Because the show kept returning to these questions, serious writers and thinkers started paying close attention. Universities added Rick and Morty to lists of pop culture worth analyzing. Writers for magazines and blogs began comparing Rick's lines to famous philosophers most people only read about in school. A full book was even published on the subject, called Rick and Morty and Philosophy. In the Beginning Was the Squanch, which became part of a well-known series of books that connects popular shows and movies to real philosophical ideas. That particular series had already covered well over 100 other topics before reaching Rick and Morty, which shows how established that kind of serious pop culture writing had become by the time Rick's turn came around. The authors of that book focused on the ideas hiding underneath the jokes, the science, and the family drama, treating Rick's outlook on existence as something worth breaking down piece by piece. The book description itself points out that Rick rejects any higher power, rejects religion, and rejects the idea that life comes with built-in meaning, while still trusting science and machines completely. That single detail already hints at the puzzle this whole video is built around. A person who trusts tools and formulas that much clearly believes some things are worth building carefully, which is a strange habit for someone who supposedly thinks nothing matters at all. What makes this especially interesting is that the people writing about Rick did not all agree on what kind of thinker he actually is. Some call him a textbook example of nihilism, the belief that life has no built-in meaning or value. Others argue that label does not fit him at all, and that he is closer to an existentialist, someone who accepts that the universe has no built-in meaning but still chooses to create meaning through his own actions and choices. Still others point out that Rick behaves like an absurdist, a person who recognizes that the universe will never make sense no matter how hard anyone searches for logic in it, yet keeps living anyway instead of giving up. These are three different and sometimes conflicting ideas, and serious writers have gone back and forth arguing about which one actually describes Rick Sanchez best. One writer who studied philosophy academically made a case that fits neither of the simple labels people usually reach for first. This writer pointed to an old idea from a philosopher named Wilfrid Sellars, who noticed a gap between how science describes the world and how people actually feel and experience their own lives day to day. Science can explain atoms, chemicals, and brain activity in exact detail, yet none of that explains why a person feels love, grief, or purpose. That gap between the cold facts of science and the warm feelings of daily life sits right at the center of Rick's character. He understands the universe down to its smallest particles, yet he still drinks himself into a stupor most nights. weeknights, and still panics the moment his family is in danger. According to this reading, Rick bounces between two responses to that gap. Sometimes he leans toward accepting there is simply no meaning to find, which lines up with absurdism. Other times he leans toward searching for his own personal meaning, despite the universe offering none, which lines up with existentialism. The writer even gave these two sides playful names, describing one as a science-based version of absurdism and the other as a science-based version of existentialism, both wrapped around the same character depending on the episode. That disagreement alone tells us something important. If Rick could be explained with one simple label, people would have settled on it years ago and moved on. Instead, essays kept getting written, comparisons kept getting drawn, and the conversation kept growing. That only happens when a character is complicated enough to support more than one reading. Rick contradicts himself constantly. He says nothing matters, then risks everything to save his family. He mocks the idea of higher meaning, then quietly builds a machine to keep the memory of someone he lost alive. He preaches that morality is fake, then still feels guilt heavy enough to drown in alcohol. A simple cartoon villain or hero does not behave this way. A person wrestling with real, unresolved questions about existence does. It also helps to understand what made the show itself such fertile ground for this kind of thinking in the first place. Rick and Morty was built around science fiction ideas that happen to overlap almost perfectly with old philosophical questions. The portal gun lets characters travel to an infinite number of parallel universes, which forces the show to constantly ask whether any single choice, any single life, or any single version of a person actually matters when countless other versions of that same choice, life, and person exist somewhere else. That is not just a fun plot device. It is a direct dramatization of questions philosophers have debated for centuries about identity, meaning, and whether individual existence carries any weight in a universe this large. Rick himself is aware of this on some level. He often points out how many versions of himself exist across the multiverse, sometimes to dismiss his own actions as unimportant, since another Rick somewhere else will make a different choice anyway. Other times, he uses that same idea to justify reckless behavior, reasoning that consequences barely matter when infinite alternate outcomes are already playing out elsewhere. This constant back and forth between using the multiverse to excuse himself and using it to torment himself is part of why his philosophy is so hard to pin down. He is not reciting a textbook position. He is a person using an enormous scientific idea to argue with himself about whether his own life has any real weight. The show also uses Morty as a kind of counterweight to Rick's worldview. Morty is younger, less experienced, and still holds on to some belief that choices should matter and that people should try to do the right thing even when the universe seems chaotic. Watching Rick and Morty argue, disagree, or quietly influence each other across different adventures gives the show a built-in structure for exploring these ideas without ever turning into a lecture. It stays a cartoon on the surface, full of jokes and wild sci-fi action, while underneath, it keeps circling back to the same heavy question again and again. Does any of this actually mean something, or not? Other characters add their own pressure to this question as well. Summer, Rick's granddaughter, spends parts of the show wrestling with whether her own existence was even planned or wanted, and her reactions push back against Rick's constant claim that nothing matters. Jerry, Rick's son-in-law, represents almost the opposite approach to life, someone who tries hard to believe in ordinary goals like a stable job and a happy family, and who often gets mocked by Rick for refusing to face harder truths about the universe. Beth, caught between her father's cold logic and her husband's simple hopes, spends much of the show unsure which side of that divide she actually belongs on. None of these characters exist purely for comedy. Each one reflects a different way a person might respond to living inside a universe that Rick insists has no built-in meaning, which turns the entire Smith family into a kind of ongoing experiment in how different personalities cope with the same unsettling idea. This is why so many people, from casual fans to trained writers, felt drawn to dig deeper into Rick's character instead of just enjoying him as a funny drunk scientist. His jokes about the universe not mattering hit differently once someone notices how often his actions contradict those very words. His calm, confident tone when explaining the multiverse hides a character who, according to the show's own creator, struggles with real spiritual unease about the parts of existence he cannot understand or control. That contrast between what Rick says and what Rick actually does became the central puzzle that pulled so many people into taking him seriously as a philosophical figure rather than dismissing him as just another cartoon character. None of this required the show to explain philosophy directly to its audience. Rick and Morty rarely stops to define big words or lecture viewers about ideas. Instead, it lets Rick live out these questions through his choices, his relationships, and his reactions to loss and danger. Viewers pick up on the tension without needing a textbook because the show frames it through family drama, sharp jokes, and huge sci-fi stakes instead of dry explanation. That approach is part of why the show reached such a wide audience while still carrying enough depth to support college essays and full-length books built around its ideas. It is worth remembering that this reputation did not appear overnight. The show built its following slowly, episode by episode, gaining more attention as fans shared favorite lines and moments with each other. Over time, certain episodes episodes stood out as turning points, where the show clearly leaned into heavier ideas rather than sticking purely to comedy. Writers who studied the show closely started connecting these specific episodes to specific philosophers and schools of thought, building a body of analysis piece by piece rather than all at once. Early seasons introduced quieter moments of doubt hidden inside adventure stories, while later seasons pushed those same doubts much further into the open, giving critics more and more material to work with as the years went on. That slow buildup is part of why the philosophical reading of Rick Sanchez feels earned rather than forced. It grew naturally out of a pattern the show kept repeating, not from a single obvious moment where the writers stopped and announced they were making a point about existence. The show's popularity also gave this conversation a much bigger stage than it might have had otherwise. Rick and Morty became one of the most talked about animated shows of its time, discussed constantly online and covered by entertainment writers around the world. That level of attention meant philosophical essays about the show reached far more readers than similar essays about smaller, less popular series ever could. A college newspaper column about a hive mind character, or a magazine piece comparing Rick to a French philosopher, could suddenly reach thousands of readers simply because the show itself already had such a massive built-in audience hungry for anything that explained why the jokes felt heavier than they should. By the time this reputation solidified, Rick Sanchez had become something rare in modern television. He is a character who is funny enough to sell merchandise and quotable enough to spread across the internet, while also being complicated enough to anchor serious academic writing. Very few cartoon characters manage both at the same time. That combination is exactly why so many different thinkers, from casual bloggers to published authors, felt the need to figure out what Rick Sanchez actually believes and why his answer keeps slipping away from any single simple label. That slipperiness is the real reason this deep dive exists. Rick calls himself a person who thinks nothing matters, and he says it loudly and often, but loud words are not the same as a settled belief, especially when someone's actions keep quietly arguing the opposite point. Over the next several sections, this video is going to walk carefully through the different philosophical labels people have placed on Rick Sanchez, testing each one against specific moments from the show itself, using his own choices as evidence, rather than relying on guesses or assumptions about what he might believe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The place to start is with the label Rick applies to himself most often, the one he repeats out loud more than any other description of his own mind, the one that sounds simple on the surface, but turns out to be far more complicated the moment his actions get examined closely. Section 02. The nihilist who says nothing matters. Rick Sanchez calls himself a nihilist, and the show has never hidden that label. Dan Harmon, the co-creator of Rick and Morty, has flatly described Rick as a lonely nihilist in interviews about the show. That word carries real weight outside of cartoons. Nihilism is the belief that life has no built-in meaning, no built-in value, and no built-in purpose. A true nihilist does not think anything is worth more than anything else, because nothing was ever worth anything to begin with. That is a heavy claim to build a television character around, yet it sits at the very center of who Rick is supposed to be. The philosopher most closely tied to this idea is Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived in the 1800s and spent much of his life studying what happens to people and cultures once they stop believing the universe has any built-in meaning. One writer who studied Nietzsche closely, a scholar named Karen Carr, described his view of nihilism as a kind of tension. It happens when a person wants the world to have deep meaning and value, but slowly realizes the world simply does not work that way. That gap between what a person wants to be true and what actually seems to be true creates a kind of crisis. The person can either fall apart from that realization or find some new way to live inside it. This description lines up almost perfectly with Rick Sanchez. He is a person who clearly once wanted life to matter, who built a family, fell in love, and tried to live a normal life, only to have that world torn apart by forces completely outside his control. What came out the other side of that experience was a man who now insists out loud that nothing matters at all. This label is not just something fans slapped onto Rick after watching a few episodes. It shows up directly in how Rick talks about the universe he lives in. He treats every choice, every risk, and every disaster as something that barely matters, because in his mind, there are infinite other versions of every choice playing out in infinite other dimensions. If something goes wrong in one universe, another version of that same event probably went right somewhere else. If a person dies in one reality, plenty of versions of that same person are still alive in countless others. Rick uses this idea constantly to explain why he does not need to feel guilty about the damage he causes. According to his own logic, nothing he breaks is truly gone, because a copy of it likely exists somewhere else in the multiverse. No episode makes this clearer than Rick Potion number 9 from the very first season of the show. The story starts small. Morty has a crush on a classmate named Jessica and begs Rick to make him a love potion so she will notice him at an upcoming school dance. Rick agrees and creates the potion using genetic material from a vole, but the chemicals inside it accidentally combine with a flu virus that Jessica happens to be carrying at the time. Instead of making Jessica fall for Morty, the potion spreads through the flu and causes everyone infected to become obsessively in love with him. Within a short time, nearly everyone at Morty's school, and then nearly everyone in town is hopelessly infatuated with a 14-year-old boy who never wanted any of this to happen. Rick tries to fix his mistake, but each attempt makes things worse instead of better. He mixes praying mantis genetic material into a stronger version of the flu virus, hoping to cancel out the original effect, but this new mixture does not cure anyone. It mutates them instead, turning ordinary people into horrifying, twisted creatures that the show calls Cronenbergs, a direct nod to a real film director named David Cronenberg, who is famous for making movies filled with disturbing body transformations. Within a very short amount of time, the entire population of the town, and soon the entire planet, has been turned into these grotesque monsters. The disaster is total. There is no group of people left to save, no clean fix left to attempt, and no version of that world Rick can hand back to his family in one piece. At this point, a person who actually believed his own choices carried weight might spend the rest of the episode desperately trying to reverse the damage, or at least trying to save whoever could still be saved. Rick does something completely different. He decides the situation is beyond repair and simply gives up on that entire version of reality. Using his portal gun, he searches across the multiverse until he finds another dimension where a nearly identical disaster already happened, except in that version, a different Rick and a different Morty had already died trying to fix it themselves. Rick brings his own Morty into this new dimension, and together they bury their dead counterparts in the backyard of that alternate house. Once the burial is finished, Rick and Morty simply walk inside and quietly take over the lives of the versions of themselves they just buried, stepping into a new family, a new house, and a new version of Beth, Jerry, and Summer, as if nothing unusual happened at all. This is not a small detail buried in the background of the episode. It is the entire ending, delivered without any real acknowledgement from Rick that what he just did was strange or wrong. He did not repair the disaster he personally caused. He abandoned an entire ruined world full of transformed, suffering people and replaced his old life with someone else's, treating an entire version of his family as something interchangeable with another. From Rick's point of view, this solves the problem completely. The Morty walking around at the end of the episode gets to keep living, even though it is not technically the same reality that existed before the love potion went wrong. Rick does not appear troubled by this outcome. He behaves as though switching one destroyed dimension for a slightly less destroyed one is simply the practical, obvious answer, the same way someone might swap out a broken tool for a replacement instead of trying to fix the original. Morty reacts very differently. The episode ends with him sitting in his new living room, staring blankly ahead, clearly shaken by what just happened. He watched dead versions of his own family get buried, then walked straight into a version of that same family as though nothing occurred. The show does not give Morty any comforting speech to make this feel okay. It simply lets the moment sit there, heavy and unresolved, with a slow, sad song playing over the final shot. That contrast between Rick's total lack of concern and Morty's silent horror captures the show's version of nihilism perfectly. Rick is not devastated because, in his mind, the specific people involved were never truly irreplaceable to begin with. Morty is devastated because, to him, they clearly were. The post-credit scene of that same episode pushes the theme even further. It reveals that the family left behind in the original ruined dimension, Jerry, Beth, and Summer, are not actually suffering the way viewers might expect. Despite living in a world overrun by monstrous Cronenbergs, they seem completely fine with Rick and Morty being gone, admitting that they are, if anything, happier without them. The scene deliberately undercuts any easy assumption that abandoning that reality was some kind of tragedy that needed fixing. Even the family Rick left behind does not seem to want him back. The episode refuses to hand viewers a clean moral lesson about right and wrong, choosing instead to leave the whole situation sitting in an uncomfortable, unresolved space, which mirrors exactly the kind of universe Rick believes he lives in, one with no built-in answers waiting to make everything feel better. This pattern of treating entire realities as replaceable did not appear only once. It became one of the show's most consistent ideas across many later seasons, always tracing back to this early episode as the moment it first became explicit. Rick's decision to abandon one dimension for another established, right from the start of the series, that he does not view any single version of his life as sacred or irreplaceable. If one version breaks beyond repair, in his mind, another nearly identical version is usually sitting nearby, ready to be stepped into instead. A second major piece of evidence for Rick's nihilism comes from a very different kind of episode, one built around a wild house party rather than a world-ending disaster. In Ricksy Business, the finale of the first season, Beth and Jerry leave for a night out, warning Rick that he and Morty will lose the privilege of going on any more adventures together if anything happens to the house while they are gone. Naturally, Rick and Summer decide to throw a massive party instead of following that instruction, inviting a mix of teenagers, aliens, members of an organization called the Council of Ricks, and several strange creatures from across the galaxy. One of the guests who shows up uninvited is a character named Abradolf Linkler, sometimes spelled Abradolf Linkler, depending on the source, a creature Rick had created years earlier by combining the genetic material of two very different real historical figures, Abraham Lincoln and Adolf Hitler. Rick's original goal with this experiment had been to create a morally neutral leader, blending together two extremely opposite personalities in the hope that the mixture would somehow balance out into something wise and fair. Instead, the actual result was a confused, emotionally unstable being who does not know whether he is supposed to be kind or cruel, heroic or hateful. He spends much of his short appearance in the episode desperately trying to prove himself worthy of Rick's approval, revealing along the way just how badly this experiment had already gone wrong long before this party ever happened. At one point during the chaos of the party, Linkler confronts Rick directly, angry and confused about why he was ever created at all, considering how much pain his split, contradictory identity has caused him. He essentially accuses Rick of bringing him into existence purely as an experiment, without any real concern for what kind of life that experiment might actually live once it was created. Rick does not offer him comfort or apology. He treats the whole situation with the same detached amusement he treats most disasters throughout the episode, more interested in getting through the night's chaos than in reckoning with the fact that he built a living, suffering person purely to test an idea, then abandoned that person once the experiment failed to produce whatever result he was hoping for. This detail matters just as much as the Cronenberg disaster, even though it plays out through comedy instead of horror. Rick did not simply make a mistake with dangerous chemicals that spiraled out of his control the way the love potion did. He deliberately created a living being for the sole purpose of curiosity, mixing together the genetic material of two men connected to some of the most serious history most students learn about in school, without any apparent thought for what that creature's actual life and identity might feel like once it existed. When the experiment produced a confused, unstable result instead of the balanced leader Rick hoped for, he simply moved on, treating the failure as background noise rather than something requiring any real responsibility on his part. Taken together, these two episodes show the same underlying idea approached from two very different angles. In Rick Potion number 9, Rick treats an entire destroyed reality filled with countless transformed and suffering people as something replaceable, something he can simply swap out for a slightly better version elsewhere in the multiverse. In Ricksy Business, Rick treats a single created life, one he personally brought into existence through his own choices, with that same casual detachment, showing no real guilt over the confusion and suffering that life now has to carry. Both moments point toward the same conclusion. Rick does not appear to believe that individual lives, individual realities, or individual outcomes carry any built-in weight of their own. To him, if something breaks, it can usually be replaced, discarded, or abandoned without requiring any deep moral reckoning. This worldview did not appear out of nowhere. Something clearly pushed Rick toward this way of thinking long before the events shown in the earliest episodes of the show. A person does not casually walk away from a fully ruined reality or shrug off the suffering of a life he personally created without having already convinced himself on some deep level that these kinds of losses simply do not carry the weight most people assume they should. That kind of certainty usually only comes from somewhere painful, somewhere buried well beneath the jokes and the science experiments that fill most of Rick's days. There is also a quieter, more personal piece of evidence for Rick's nihilism running underneath nearly every episode of the show, one that rarely gets discussed with the same attention as a giant monster disaster or a genetic experiment gone wrong. Rick drinks constantly. He is almost never shown fully sober, carrying a flask, drinking directly from bottles, or slurring his words through even the most serious conversations. The show treats this as a basic, unremarkable part of who Rick is, rarely stopping to explain it directly, yet it fits perfectly with everything nihilism suggests about a person who has convinced himself nothing truly matters. If a person genuinely believed his own life, his own choices, and his own family carried no real weight, there would be very little reason to stay clear-headed and present for any of it. The drinking becomes less like a comedic personality quirk and more like quiet evidence of a man numbing himself against a worldview he claims to have fully accepted, but clearly still finds difficult to sit inside without some kind of escape close at hand. None of this means Rick spends his days walking around calmly explaining nihilism to anyone who will listen. He rarely uses the word directly. Instead, the show reveals this belief through his choices, his reactions, and the strange calm he shows in moments that would break most other people completely. Watching an entire reality collapse into monstrous chaos and simply relocating to a slightly better version of that same disaster is not something an ordinary person could shrug off so easily. Creating a suffering, confused being purely out of scientific curiosity, then brushing aside that being's pain when it confronts him directly, is not something an ordinary person could treat as background noise at a party. Rick can, because underneath all the science and the jokes, he has built his entire outlook around the idea that none of it was ever going to matter in any lasting way, regardless of what he chooses to do. This raises an important question that the rest of this deep dive is going to spend considerable time exploring. If Rick truly believed nothing mattered at all, in the deepest and most consistent sense of that word, it would be reasonable to expect him to behave with total indifference toward everything around him at all times. Yet that is not actually what happens across the wider span of the show. Rick panics the moment his family faces real danger. He goes to extreme, exhausting lengths to protect Morty, Summer, and Beth, often at serious risk to himself. He becomes visibly emotional in certain private moments, even while insisting loudly that emotions themselves are meaningless. These contradictions do not erase the nihilism shown so clearly in episodes like Rick Potion Number 9 and Ricksy Business. Instead, they suggest that Rick's nihilism might not be as complete or as settled as his own words claim it to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That gap between what Rick says about the universe and what Rick actually does when the universe threatens the people closest to him becomes the exact spot where a very different philosophical idea starts pushing its way into the picture, one that does not ask whether life has meaning, but instead asks what a person is supposed to do once they have already accepted that it might not. Section 03, Rolling the Boulder. With Rick, nihilism and absurdism sound like they should mean the same thing, but they do not. Nihilism says nothing has meaning, full stop. Absurdism agrees that the universe offers no meaning, but it adds something nihilism does not bother with. It asks what a person is supposed to do next, once they have already accepted that the universe will never hand them a clear answer. The most famous philosopher connected to this idea is Albert Camus, a French writer who spent much of his career explaining that people are stuck between two facts that never quite fit together. People want life to make sense, and the universe simply refuses to cooperate. Camus called that mismatch the absurd, and he spent an entire essay explaining what a person should do once they notice it. Camus used an old Greek story to explain his point. In that story, a man named Sisyphus is punished by the gods and forced to push a large boulder up a hill for the rest of eternity. Every single time he nearly reaches the top, the boulder rolls back down to the bottom, forcing him to start over again, forever. Camus argued that this task, completely pointless on its surface, actually says something important about every single human life. People wake up, work, eat, sleep, and repeat the same basic pattern day after day, chasing goals that often crumble the moment they are reached, only to set new goals and start pushing again. Camus believed the most important moment in the whole story happens right after the boulder rolls back down, in the brief walk back down the hill when Sisyphus fully understands what is happening to him. Camus called this his hour of consciousness. Instead of breaking him, this awareness is what actually frees him, because once a person accepts that the task will never truly end, they are also free to stop searching for some hidden meaning behind it and simply choose how they want to carry on anyway. Rick and Morty leans directly into this idea more than once, and one of the clearest examples involves something almost embarrassingly small for a man who claims to be the smartest being in the universe. In the Season 3 premiere, an episode called The Rick Shank Rickdemption, Rick spends the entire episode escaping from a powerful organization called the Galactic Federation, tearing apart their entire operation from the inside, and eventually helping bring down the Citadel of Ricks as well. By any normal measure, this is one of the biggest, most important things Rick accomplishes across the whole series. Yet at the very end of the episode, once the dust has settled, and Morty expects some kind of meaningful explanation for why Rick just did all of this, Rick reveals his actual motivation. He was not driven by revenge, or by saving his family, or by taking down a corrupt government. His entire plan, from beginning to end, was built around a specific discontinued dipping sauce that a fast food restaurant once sold as a limited promotion tied to a movie release back in 1998. Rick tells Morty directly that getting his hands on that sauce again is his series arc, even joking that he is willing to spend 9 seasons chasing it if that is what it takes. This line was delivered with such conviction that real fans outside the show began demanding that the actual restaurant bring the sauce back, and the restaurant eventually did exactly that, years after the original promotion had ended. On the surface, this whole storyline is just a joke about a man wasting enormous effort on something meaningless. Underneath that joke, it lines up almost perfectly with Camus's description of the absurd. Rick has access to unlimited power, unlimited knowledge, and access to infinite realities, yet the thing pulling him forward through disaster after disaster is a small, silly craving, completely disconnected from anything grand or important. Rather than treating this as depressing, the show treats it as almost triumphant, since Rick still gets up, still fights, and still pushes forward toward his goal, regardless of how absurd that goal actually is. This pattern shows up again in a much earlier episode called Ricksty Minutes from the first season of the show. In that episode, Rick installs a strange cable box that lets the family watch television broadcasts pulled from countless different realities at once, giving them access to an endless stream of channels showing every imaginable version of life happening somewhere else in the multiverse. While flipping through these channels, an old argument between Jerry and Beth reignites, eventually leading to a painful confession. Jerry admits that Summer was not a planned pregnancy, and that both he and Beth had once considered not going through with it at all. Summer, overhearing all of this, is devastated. She decides she wants to run away from home immediately, feeling like an accident nobody actually wanted in the first place. Morty follows her upstairs to try to calm her down, and instead of offering the kind of comforting speech most shows would reach for in this moment, he tells her something else entirely. He points outside to the backyard, toward the graves that he and Rick dug back in Rick Potion number 9, and finally reveals the truth behind those graves. He tells Summer that the version of her brother she grew up with is actually buried in that yard, and that the Morty standing in front of her right now came from a different, nearly identical reality after that original disaster occurred. He explains that no matter which version of reality anyone happens to be living in, nobody exists for some specific built-in reason. Nobody truly belongs anywhere in any permanent sense, and everybody eventually dies regardless of what choices they make along the way. Then, almost gently, he suggests they simply go back downstairs and watch television instead. This scene captures the absurdist response almost perfectly, standing in stark contrast to the pure nihilism explored in the section before this one. A strict nihilist would have no real reason to comfort Summer at all, since nothing she feels would matter either way. Morty does something slightly different. He acknowledges the harsh, uncomfortable truth completely, without softening it or pretending some hidden meaning is waiting just out of sight to make everything better. At the same time, he does not use that harsh truth as a reason to give up or fall apart. He offers Summer a small, ordinary way to keep living anyway, even if that way happens to be something as simple as sitting down together and watching a show. Summer, notably, chooses to stay. She does not run away. She goes back downstairs with her brother and joins the rest of the family in front of the television, choosing to keep going, despite everything she just learned about her own beginning. This response mirrors exactly what Camus argued Sisyphus discovers on his long walk back down the hill after watching the boulder roll away from him one more time. Sisyphus does not receive any final answer explaining why he was chosen for this punishment, and he does not find some clever way to escape the task itself. He simply keeps walking back toward the boulder, fully aware of what waits for him at the top, choosing to continue the pattern anyway, rather than surrendering to despair. Rick and Morty repeats this same basic shape again and again across different episodes, swapping out boulders for dipping sauces, alternate realities, and painful family confessions, while landing on the same underlying idea each time. The universe will not hand anyone a clean, satisfying reason for their struggles. The only real choice left is whether to keep moving forward anyway. It is worth noticing how differently this plays out compared to the nihilism shown through Rick's actions in the disaster from Rick Potion number 9 and the party chaos from Ricksy Business. In those earlier moments, Rick treated broken realities and suffering created lives as simply replaceable, something to abandon and move past without much concern. Absurdism does not ask Rick or anyone else in the show to abandon anything. Instead, it asks him to keep showing up, keep chasing his ridiculous dipping sauce, keep protecting his family through one disaster after another, all while fully believing that none of it carries any built-in cosmic importance. That is a subtle but important difference. Nihilism shrugs and walks away. Absurdism shrugs and keeps walking forward anyway, boulder and all. This distinction matters because it explains why Rick does not behave like a character who has actually given up on life, despite constantly insisting out loud that nothing about life matters. A person who had truly given up would not spend an entire season working toward a fast food sauce, and would not go to such extreme lengths just to protect a family he supposedly views as replaceable. Someone still fighting that hard, even while insisting none of it means anything, looks a lot closer to Camus' description of a person who has accepted the absurd and kept pushing anyway, rather than someone who has genuinely stopped caring altogether. The Ricksy Minutes scene adds another layer worth sitting with carefully. Morty is not simply repeating something Rick taught him word for word. He is applying the same basic outlook he has picked up from years of watching Rick handle disaster after disaster, translating it into his own words for his sister's benefit. This shows that the philosophy explored throughout this video is not limited to Rick alone. It has already started spreading outward into how the people closest to him think and cope with their own pain, whether they fully realize it or not. Summer, faced with the devastating news that her own existence was originally unwanted, ultimately chooses comfort and connection over isolation, walking back downstairs to sit with her family rather than running away into the night. That small, quiet choice echoes the same idea found underneath the much bigger, flashier Szechuan sauce storyline. Life keeps handing out reasons to feel like nothing matters, and the people inside this story keep choosing to stay anyway. None of this answers the deeper questions sitting underneath both nihilism and absurdism, one that becomes impossible to ignore the moment Rick's own actions are placed side by side with his own words. If Rick truly lived according to either of these philosophies with full consistency, his fierce, repeated efforts to protect his family would make very little sense. A person who believes nothing matters, or even a person who has simply accepted that the universe offers no answers, should not panic and fight so desperately every time that family faces real danger. Yet, that is exactly what Rick does, over and over again, across nearly every major crisis the show puts him through. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That specific contradiction opens the door to a completely different philosophical reading of Rick Sanchez, one that does not ask whether life has meaning at all, but instead focuses on what happens once a person quietly decides to build meaning of their own, whether they are willing to admit it out loud or not. Section 04, Meaning in a Meaningless Multiverse Nihilism, says nothing matters. Absurdism says nothing has to matter for a person to keep living anyway. Existentialism takes one more step past both of those ideas. It agrees that the universe does not hand anyone a built-in purpose, but it argues that people are still free free to build their own meaning through the choices they actually make. A true existentialist does not wait around for the universe to explain why anything is worthwhile. They decide what matters to them personally, then act on that decision, even knowing full well that nothing forced them to care in the first place. A philosopher named Wilfrid Sellars, working long before Rick and Morty ever existed, noticed a strange gap sitting at the center of human life. He pointed out that science can explain the entire physical world in incredible detail, breaking everything down into atoms, chemicals, and brain signals. Yet none of that detailed science actually explains why people feel love, grief, loyalty, or purpose in their daily lives. Science describes what things are made of. It does not explain why any of it should feel important to the people living through it. One writer studying Rick and Morty took this exact idea from Sellars and applied it directly to the show, arguing that Rick spends the entire series bouncing between two different responses to that gap. Sometimes he leans toward accepting that nothing truly matters, which lines up with absurdism. Other times he leans toward deciding that something does matter to him personally, purely because he has chosen to treat it that way, which lines up with existentialism. The writer gave this second version a specific name, calling it a science-based existentialism, since Rick never abandons his understanding of cold, hard facts about the universe, even while choosing to care deeply about a small handful of people inside it. Nowhere does this show up more clearly than in the choice Rick makes at the end of the second season, in an episode called The Wedding Squanchers. Throughout that episode, Rick and his family attend the wedding of his close friend Birdperson, only for the event to collapse into chaos once the Galactic Federation, a powerful organization controlling large parts of the galaxy, tracks them down. Rick and his entire family become wanted fugitives, forced to hide out together in cramped, uncomfortable conditions on a tiny, barely habitable planet just to avoid capture. Rather than let his family continue living that way indefinitely, Rick makes a decision. He turns himself in directly to the Galactic Federation, allowing himself to be captured and imprisoned so that Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty can go back to living normal lives on Earth instead of hiding in fear for the rest of their days. This decision does not fit comfortably inside pure nihilism at all. A person who genuinely believed nothing mattered and that his family could simply be replaced or abandoned the way Rick treated an entire ruined reality back in Rick Potion number 9 would have no real reason to sacrifice his own freedom this way, turning himself over to a hostile government, knowing full well he would likely face interrogation and permanent imprisonment, is not the action of someone who sees his family as disposable. It is the action of someone who has decided, through his own personal choice, that their safety and normal lives matter enough to him to be worth trading his own freedom for. Existentialism does not require Rick to believe the universe demanded this sacrifice from him. It only requires that Rick chose to make it anyway, purely because he decided it mattered to him. The following season picks this thread up again, through a very different kind of story, one built around comedy and body horror rather than sacrifice and imprisonment. In an episode called Pickle Rick, Beth schedules a family therapy session for herself, Summer, and Morty, arranged through their school after some ongoing behavioral concerns. Rick, given the option to attend, instead spends an entire day building an elaborate machine that transforms his own body into a pickle, going out of his way to avoid setting foot anywhere near that appointment. What follows is an extended, absurd action-adventure, with Rick surviving being flushed into a sewer system as a pickle, constructing crude mechanical legs and weapons out of rat parts and cockroach brains, then getting swept into a violent hostage situation inside a secret military facility, all while still trapped in pickle form. By any reasonable measure, this entire chain of events represents an enormous, almost unbelievable amount of effort spent purely to dodge a single hour-long conversation with a therapist. Rick survives gunfights, escapes a heavily armed compound, and improvises weapons out of body parts scavenged from sewer creatures, all so he does not have to sit in a room and talk about his feelings. When he finally does end up face-to-face with the family therapist, a character named Dr. Wong, near the end of the episode, he openly admits that his entire elaborate pickle transformation was simply his way of avoiding this exact appointment. Dr. Wong responds with a pointed observation, telling Rick directly that he uses his own intelligence to avoid doing the harder, less glamorous work of actually fixing himself and his relationships with the people closest to him. She points out that he treats his own mind as either an unstoppable weapon or an inescapable curse, whichever framing lets him avoid ever admitting that his mind and his choices are actually within his own control the entire time. This scene reveals something important about the gap between what Rick claims to believe and how he actually behaves underneath all of his bravado. If therapy and family connection genuinely meant nothing to him, there would be no reason to go through such extreme, exhausting lengths just to avoid a single conversation. A person who truly did not care would simply skip the appointment without a second thought, the same casual way Rick abandoned an entire ruined reality back in Rick Potion number 9 without any visible guilt. Instead, Rick builds an entire pickle transformation machine, survives multiple life-threatening situations, and ultimately still ends up sitting across from that same therapist by the episode's end anyway. The lengths he goes to specifically to avoid emotional vulnerability actually prove how much that vulnerability threatens him, which only only makes sense if some part of him already recognizes how much his family and his relationship with them actually matters to him personally. Dr. Wong's assessment lines up closely with the existentialist reading of Rick's character running underneath this entire video. Rick is not a man without any personal values or commitments. He is a man who has built an entire persona around pretending those values and commitments do not exist, because openly admitting they exist would force him to confront just how much power his family already holds over his own choices and emotions. He would rather fight through sewers and secret military compounds, literally reshaping his own body into new forms just to avoid one conversation, than sit still and admit that his daughter's concern for him actually reaches him on some level. That is not the behavior of a man who has fully accepted nihilism. It is the behavior of a man actively running from the fact that he has already, whether he wants to admit it or not, decided that something in his life matters enough to protect. These two episodes, though very different in tone, work together to build the same underlying argument. In The Wedding Squanchers, Rick makes a direct, deliberate sacrifice for his family, choosing imprisonment over letting them continue living as fugitives. In Pickle Rick, Rick goes to enormous, painful lengths specifically to avoid confronting how much his relationship with that same family actually affects him. Both stories point toward a version of Rick who has quietly built his own personal meaning around protecting and staying connected to a specific group of people, even while loudly insisting, whenever anyone will listen, that nothing in the universe carries any real weight at all. This tension between Rick's words and Rick's actions is not a flaw in the writing of the show. It is the entire engine driving why so many people found Rick worth studying seriously in the first place. A character who consistently acted exactly the way he talked would be simple to understand and quick to forget. A character who says one thing while consistently doing another forces an audience to dig deeper, searching for the real explanation hiding underneath the surface. Existentialism offers exactly that kind of explanation. Rick has not necessarily rejected meaning altogether, the way pure nihilism would require. He has instead built a very narrow, very specific version of meaning, centered almost entirely around a small handful of people, choosing them deliberately, even while refusing to admit out loud that this choice contradicts almost everything else he claims to believe about the universe. It is worth remembering that existentialism does not ask Rick to feel good about this decision, or to talk about it openly, or to behave consistently every single time his family is threatened. It only requires that he keeps choosing to act as though they matter, over and over again, regardless of how loudly he insists otherwise in every other part of his life. Turning himself into a hostile government is one version of that choice. Surviving a war-torn sewer system just to avoid admitting his own vulnerability is a stranger, messier version of that same underlying pattern, but it points toward the same basic truth sitting underneath both stories. Somewhere beneath the drinking, the sarcasm, and the constant insistence that nothing in the universe carries any weight, Rick Sanchez has already decided, through his own actions rather than his own words, that certain things in his life are worth fighting for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That contradiction between what Rick says and what Rick does never resolves neatly, and the show never rushes to tie it into a simple, comforting bow. It keeps testing that same tension from new angles instead. One of the sharpest tests has nothing to do with family therapy or government prison. It asks a colder question about choice itself, one that strips away comfort entirely. Do choices mean anything if a person can simply reset them the moment things go wrong? Section 05, the vat of acid and the trap of free choice. Free will means a person actually chooses their own path, with real options open in front of them at every step. Determinism means something else entirely. It means every event, including every human choice, was already locked into place long before it happened, set off by countless smaller causes stacking on top of each other like dominoes. If determinism is true, then no one ever really chooses anything. They only feel like they are choosing, while the outcome was already decided the moment the dominoes started falling. Rick and Morty takes this old argument and turns it into one of its most quietly devastating episodes, using a strange, dark idea that starts as a joke and slowly becomes something much heavier by the end. The episode is called the Vat of Acid episode, and it opens with Rick and Morty on a routine trip to a factory, picking up valuable crystals from a group of alien traders. The deal goes wrong. The traders reveal they have scammed Rick, and with weapons pointed at both of them, Rick pulls out an escape plan he apparently keeps ready for situations exactly like this one. He and Morty jump into a vat that looks like acid, sinking to the bottom while the traders assume they just watched a grandfather and his grandson kill themselves rather than face capture. Rick and Morty wait quietly at the bottom of the vat, breathing through a hidden setup built specifically for this kind of escape until the traders eventually give up and leave. It is later revealed that Rick is not even the version of Morty's original grandfather, but a different Rick entirely, one who casually explains that every version of Rick keeps some version of a vat of acid ready for exactly this kind of emergency. That detail alone says something important. Faking death is not a one-time trick Rick invented on the spot. It is a standing part of how many different versions of Rick move through the universe, a rehearsed answer to the same basic problem of running out of real options. Morty is furious about about the whole plan once it is finally revealed to him, telling Rick that faking a suicide in front of traumatized witnesses was an objectively terrible idea, poorly thought through, and needlessly disturbing. Rick, annoyed at being criticized by someone he considers far less experienced and far less intelligent than himself, challenges Morty to come up with something better. Morty says the obvious thing that occurred to him, an idea that sounds almost too simple. He suggests a device, like a save button in a video game, something a person could press to instantly return to an earlier point whenever things went badly wrong, undoing any mistake without having to actually live through its consequences. Rick, more to prove Morty wrong than to actually help him, builds exactly that. He hands Morty a small remote with a single button, explaining that it will let him return to a saved point in time whenever he presses it, without bothering to explain any further detail about how the device actually works underneath the surface. What follows shows Morty testing the full range of what a consequence-free life might look like, once a person believes nothing they do can ever truly stick. He starts small, sneaking into places he normally could not go, and playing pranks that would usually carry real risk, resetting the moment anything threatens to go wrong. As his confidence grows, his choices grow bolder and far less careful. He commits actual crimes, taking money and property that never belonged to him, resetting instantly the moment police or angry victims show up to stop him. Each time, the reset simply erases the immediate danger, letting Morty walk away completely untouched by whatever damage he just caused. For a while, this feels like total freedom. Morty appears to have found exactly what a person searching for perfect free will might dream about, a life where every mistake can simply be deleted and tried again. The story shifts once Morty meets a girl and begins falling for her, slowly building an actual relationship built on real conversations, shared time, and growing trust rather than quick, reckless thrills. This part of the episode plays out almost entirely without dialogue, letting the relationship unfold silently across a series of quiet, tender scenes rather than through jokes or fast pacing. Eventually, the two of them end up stranded together after a plane crash, forced to survive together in the mountains with no easy way to call for help. At this point, Morty finally has a real, serious reason to use his reset button, since the crash puts both of their lives in genuine danger. Instead, he chooses not to press it, deciding to call for an actual rescue team rather than erase everything that happened between them so far. He is willing to risk real consequences for the first time in the entire episode, purely because what he built with this person now matters more to him than the safety of a guaranteed reset. After they are rescued and returned safely home, this moment of growth gets undone by pure accident rather than any deliberate choice on Morty's part. Jerry, completely unaware of what the remote actually does, picks it up and presses the button without realizing what it will trigger. The reset wipes away the relationship Morty had just spent the entire episode building, along with the memory of surviving that plane crash together. Morty tries desperately to recreate what he lost, seeking the same girl out again and hoping to rebuild the same connection from scratch. It does not work. The spontaneous, unplanned nature of how they originally met cannot simply be recreated on command, and Morty is left grieving something that, from his father's careless point of view, may as well have never mattered at all. By the end of the episode, Morty comes to Rick with a clear, hard-earned conclusion. He tells Rick that living without any real consequences was not actually the gift it seemed to be at first. He explains that consequences are exactly what give choices any weight or meaning in the first place. Without the risk of losing something, no choice ever really costs anything, and without real cost, nothing a person does can ever build into something worth valuing. A relationship built entirely on the freedom to undo any mistake never has to survive an actual test, which means it never becomes strong enough to matter the way relationships built through real risk eventually do. This is where the episode delivers its coldest, most unsettling twist, one that pulls the entire story away from a simple lesson about growing up and turns it into something far darker. Rick, clearly satisfied that Morty has learned his intended lesson, reveals the truth about how the remote actually worked the entire time. It never reset time at all. Every single time Morty pressed that button, he was not returning to an earlier point in his own timeline. He was being teleported into a parallel dimension almost identical to his own, one where a different version of Morty already existed, living out a slightly different version of that same day. Each time Morty arrived in one of these dimensions, the native Morty, who already belonged there, simply died, replaced instantly and permanently by the Morty pressing the button. Every reset Morty believed was erasing his own mistakes was actually ending another version of his own life somewhere else, over and over again, without him ever knowing it was happening. This detail changes everything about what the episode is actually arguing. Morty did not experience genuine free will while using that remote, the kind of freedom where choices are made and consequences simply do not exist. He experienced something closer to an illusion of freedom, sitting directly on top of real, permanent consequences he never had any way of seeing. Every crime he thought he erased actually still happened somewhere, its consequences simply relocated onto people he never met and never had to think about. Every mistake he thought he undid actually still occurred, its damage quietly buried in a version of reality he was never shown. The show does not let this stay hidden either. Once the truth comes out, a growing wave of anger, grief, and outrage from across these different different dimensions, eventually catches up to Morty, arriving at his own front door in the form of an angry crowd demanding justice for crimes committed against versions of people he barely remembers hurting. Rick's decision to reveal this truth only after Morty had already reached his own conclusion about consequences is worth paying close attention to. Rick could have explained how the remote actually worked from the very beginning, sparing Morty from ever believing he had discovered true consequence-free freedom in the first place. Instead, Rick deliberately let Morty live inside that illusion long enough to genuinely believe it, long enough to build real feelings around it, and long enough to eventually break under the weight of losing something he had convinced himself did not carry any real risk. Only once Morty had already suffered through that exact emotional lesson on his own did Rick choose to reveal the darker truth hiding underneath the entire experiment. This detail says something important about Rick's own understanding of free will and determinism, one that sits underneath the surface of the episode without ever being stated outright. Rick already seems to understand, long before Morty ever does, that consequence-free choices are never actually consequence-free. They simply move the weight of those consequences somewhere less visible, onto someone or something a person has convinced themselves does not matter as much. This is not a lesson Rick needed Morty's painful experience to teach him. It is a lesson Rick already appears to know deeply enough to build an entire fake device around it, one designed specifically to expose that exact illusion once Morty had lived through enough of it to actually understand what he was being shown. There is a striking parallel between this lesson and the opening scene of the very same episode, the one where Rick and Morty fake their own deaths inside a vat of acid to escape a dangerous situation. That escape plan, much like the reset button, offers an appearance of avoiding real consequences. Rick and Morty do not actually die, and the traitors who believed they witnessed a tragic double suicide walk away completely fooled. Yet this escape plan does carry a real cost as well, one the episode shows plainly rather than hiding. The traitors who witness the fake deaths are shown expressing genuine, unexpected grief over what they believe just happened, shocked and disturbed that a grandfather would apparently choose to end both his own life and his grandson's life together rather than face capture. Faking that death did not erase consequences either. It simply shifted them onto witnesses who now carry a disturbing memory of something that, as far as they will ever know, was completely real. Taken together, these two moments, the opening fake death and the closing reveal about the reset button, build toward the same underlying argument about how Rick actually understands the world, regardless of what he claims to believe about nihilism elsewhere in the show. Rick behaves, again and again, as though he already fully understands that consequences cannot actually be erased, no matter how clever the escape plan or how convincing the illusion of a clean reset might look on the surface. They can only be redirected, hidden, or delayed, shifted onto someone else's shoulders instead of disappearing altogether. This is a much colder, harder form of belief than simple nihilism, since it does not claim consequences are meaningless. It claims the opposite. Consequences are permanent and unavoidable, and the only real choice available to anyone is deciding who ends up carrying them. This adds an important new layer to the growing picture of Rick built up across this video so far. In earlier sections, Rick's stated nihilism painted him as someone who believes nothing carries any lasting weight, yet the events of this specific episode suggest something almost opposite, sitting underneath that stated belief. Rick behaves like a man who understands better than almost anyone else in the entire show that everything carries weight somewhere, that every choice leaves a mark on someone, and that pretending otherwise is simply a more dangerous, more dishonest way of avoiding that fact rather than actually escaping it. Teaching Morty this lesson through direct, painful experience, rather than through a quick explanation, suggests Rick wanted his grandson to feel the full weight of that truth rather than simply be told about it secondhand. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises a question hard to avoid once this episode sits next to everything explored so far. If Rick already understands that consequences never truly disappear, his loud declarations that nothing matters start looking less like a settled belief and more like a performance. That performance gets tested even harder against a very different situation, one involving a force that offers to erase the burden of choice by erasing the individual instead. Section 06, Unity, and the Price of Belonging. Every philosophy explored so far in this video has centered on one single person figuring out how to live inside a universe that refuses to hand out easy answers. This next episode shifts that question in a completely different direction. Instead of asking what one person should believe, it asks what happens when an entire group of people gives up their individual identities altogether, choosing instead to become part of one single shared mind. The episode is called Autoerotic Assimilation, and it introduces one of the strangest and most quietly unsettling characters in the entire series, a hive mind named Unity. A hive mind is a being made up of many different bodies, all controlled by a single shared consciousness. Individual people lose their own private thoughts, their own separate choices, and their own personal identities, folding instead into one collective will that speaks and acts through all of them at once. Unity is exactly this kind of being, and by the time Rick, Morty, and Summer arrive at the planet where the episode takes place, Unity has already taken over the minds and bodies of an an entire population. Every person living there has been absorbed into this single consciousness, no longer making individual choices of their own, no longer holding separate opinions or private thoughts, existing instead as extensions of one much larger mind spread across countless different bodies at the same time. Rick and Unity, it turns out, share a history together. The two of them have what the show describes as an old romantic relationship, one they clearly enjoyed at some point in the past, despite Unity technically being an enormous collective mind rather than any single individual person. Their reunion in this episode plays out with obvious warmth and familiarity, showing a side of Rick that appears more relaxed and more emotionally open than almost anywhere else in the series. Summer, watching this reunion unfold, reacts with clear discomfort. She struggles to understand how her grandfather could have any kind of relationship with something that controls an entire population against their own will, treating individual people as interchangeable parts of one much bigger, unified system rather than as separate people with their own lives and choices. This disagreement between Rick and Summer becomes the heart of the episode's philosophical question. Unity defends her way of running the planet by pointing out everything she has accomplished through total control. She has eliminated conflict between different groups, since there are no longer separate groups left to fight with each other once everyone shares the same mind. She has removed crime, poverty, and disorder, since every choice made by every person on the planet flows directly from one single, coordinated will, rather than countless competing individual decisions pulling against each other. From this angle, Unity's argument sounds almost reasonable. A world without conflict, without crime, and without the kind of chaos caused by millions of people disagreeing with each other constantly does sound, on paper, like an improvement over life as most people currently know it. Summer refuses to accept this trade. She argues that even if Unity's version of order looks peaceful and functional from the outside, it comes at a cost that outweighs whatever benefits it provides. The people living under Unity's control did not choose this outcome for themselves. Their individual identities, their private thoughts, and their personal freedom to disagree, to make mistakes, or to simply exist as separate people were all taken from them the moment Unity absorbed them into her collective mind. Summer tries at one point to free some of the people under Unity's control, hoping to give them back some version of their own independent lives, only to run into the same basic problem facing anyone who challenges a hive mind directly. Since Unity controls every single mind on the planet at once, there is no version of the population left standing outside her control that Summer can actually reach or convince. Everyone she might try to save is already speaking, thinking, and acting as an extension of the very system she is trying to fight against. The episode does not simply hand Summer's argument an easy, uncomplicated victory either. It complicates the picture further by showing what actually happens once Unity's control over the population starts slipping. As Rick and Unity spend more time together, distracted by their own reunion, some of Unity's hold over her collective bodies weakens temporarily, freeing a portion of the population to think and act independently again for the first time in a long while. Rather than showing these newly freed individuals embracing their restored freedom peacefully, the episode shows them almost immediately falling into violent conflict with each other, reigniting old tensions between different groups that Unity's control had previously kept buried and quiet. Within moments of regaining their independence, these people are fighting, and Morty and Summer briefly find themselves caught directly in the middle of that sudden outbreak of violence. This detail matters enormously to the philosophical question sitting underneath the entire episode. If total freedom immediately produces violence and chaos the instant it is restored, then Unity's argument about the value of unity and control gains real weight, even if her methods remain deeply troubling. The episode does not resolve this tension by proving one side completely right and the other side completely wrong. It instead lets both possibilities sit uncomfortably close together, forcing anyone paying attention to weigh two genuinely difficult outcomes against each other. One option offers peace and order, purchased through the total loss of individual freedom and identity. The other option offers freedom and individuality, purchased through the real risk of renewed conflict, violence, and disorder, the moment that freedom returns. Rick's role throughout this entire situation reveals something important about how he personally seems to weigh this same trade-off. Even though he never states his position directly the way Summer does, he does not seem bothered by Unity's control over an entire planet the way his granddaughter clearly is. He reconnects with Unity warmly, enjoys their time together, without expressing any visible discomfort about what that relationship actually represents, and shows no urgency to help free the population the way Summer instinctively tries to do. This lines up closely with patterns already explored earlier in this video. Rick has shown, again and again, that he does not view every individual life as automatically sacred or untouchable. He abandoned an entire ruined reality back in Rick Potion number 9 without much visible guilt. He created a suffering, confused life purely as an experiment in Rixie business, then brushed off that life's pain once the experiment failed to produce the result he wanted. His comfort around Unity fits neatly into that same broader pattern, suggesting that individual freedom and individual identity do not carry the kind of automatic, untouchable importance to Rick that they clearly carry to Summer. At the same time, Rick Rick does not act like someone who fully endorses Unity's total erasure of individual choice either. He never argues in favor of what Unity has built, the way Unity herself does. He simply seems personally unbothered by it, treating the entire moral question with the same detached distance he treats most disasters throughout the series, more interested in enjoying his reunion than weighing in on whether that reunion is built on top of something troubling. This distance itself says something meaningful. Rick is not shown actively defending forced collective control as a good thing worth spreading elsewhere. He is shown simply not caring enough about the trade-off to let it interrupt his own personal enjoyment of the moment, which is a slightly different, though equally revealing position to hold. Unity's own internal conflict adds one more important layer to this episode that goes beyond the simple disagreement between Rick and Summer. At certain points, Unity expresses genuine affection for Rick in a way that suggests something resembling an individual personality still exists somewhere underneath her role as a collective consciousness spread across countless bodies. She seems drawn to him specifically, rather than experiencing him the same generic way she experiences every other person and situation she encounters. This detail raises an interesting question about whether total collective identity can ever fully erase every trace of individuality, or whether some small, persistent spark of personal preference and personal history manages to survive even inside a mind built specifically to erase those exact qualities in everyone else it absorbs. By the end of the episode, Unity ultimately decides to leave Rick rather than stay and continue their relationship, recognizing that being around him repeatedly threatens to undermine the very control she has worked to build and maintain across her population. She writes him a message explaining that being near him makes her want to be an individual again, rather than remain a collective mind, and that this pull toward individuality poses too great a risk to the stability she has created. This decision suggests that Unity herself, despite defending collective control throughout the episode, recognizes on some level that maintaining that level of control requires constant vigilance against exactly the kind of personal connection and individual desire that Rick represents to her. Her choice to leave, rather than risk losing herself to those feelings, becomes its own quiet argument in favor of Summer's original concern. Even the architect of this collective system seems to understand that individuality carries a pull too strong to fully suppress forever, one she ultimately chooses to protect her control against, rather than risk testing any further. This entire episode connects back to the larger question running through this whole deep dive in an important way. Nihilism, absurdism, and existentialism, the ideas explored across the earlier sections of this video, all assume a single individual person wrestling with questions about meaning and choice. Unity offers a completely different kind of answer to those same underlying anxieties about meaning and purpose, one that does not require any individual person to wrestle with those questions at all. If a person's private thoughts, choices, and identity are simply absorbed into something larger and more coordinated, the exhausting search for personal meaning that drives characters like Rick to drink, argue, and self-destruct throughout the series simply disappears along with the individual self that used to carry it. Unity does not need to search for meaning the way Rick does, because Unity has already removed the individual perspective that made searching necessary in the first place. Rick's comfort around this idea, even while never fully embracing it as his own personal solution, adds an interesting wrinkle to everything explored about his character so far. A committed existentialist, the kind explored in the previous sections through Rick's sacrifice for his family and his elaborate avoidance of family therapy, should feel a strong pull toward protecting his own individual choices and his own personal meaning, since that meaning depends entirely on him remaining a distinct, separate person capable of making his own decisions. Yet Rick shows no visible urgency to challenge Unity's total erasure of individual identity across an entire planet, treating the philosophical stakes of that erasure with far less concern than his granddaughter does. This suggests that Rick's commitment to individual freedom and personal meaning may only extend as far as it applies to himself and the small handful of people he has personally chosen to care about, rather than reflecting some broader, more consistent belief in the value of individuality as a universal principle worth defending everywhere he encounters it. Summer's reaction throughout the episode offers a useful contrast that helps sharpen exactly what is at stake in this disagreement. She has not yet lived through the same losses and disappointments that appear to have shaped Rick's outlook long before the events of the series even began. Her instinct to defend individual freedom, even for strangers she has just met on a planet she will likely never visit again, suggests a value system built around the idea that personal identity and personal choice matter simply because they belong to someone, regardless of whether that someone happens to be family, a stranger, or an entire unfamiliar population. Rick's comparative indifference suggests a much narrower, more selective version of that same value, one that activates powerfully when his own family is directly threatened, as shown through his sacrifice in the wedding squanchers, but stays largely dormant when the people at risk are strangers whose freedom does not personally affect him or the small circle of people he has decided are worth protecting. This narrower, more selective approach to valuing individual freedom fits into a larger pattern building steadily across this entire video. Rick does not appear to operate according to one one single, consistent philosophy applied evenly across every situation he encounters. He shifts between different approaches depending on what is actually at stake in front of him at any given moment. When his own family faces real danger, something resembling existentialism takes over, pushing him toward real sacrifice and real protective action. When an entire unfamiliar population loses its individual freedom to a hive mind he happens to have a personal history with, something closer to detached indifference takes over instead, letting him enjoy his reunion without much concern for the deeper questions Summer is asking about consent and control. Neither pure nihilism, pure absurdism, nor pure existentialism fully explains this shifting situational pattern of behavior on its own. Something else appears to be steering these decisions underneath the surface, something that has less to do with any single settled philosophy and more to do with which specific people happen to be standing directly in front of Rick at any given moment. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That distinction between how Rick treats the people closest to him and how he treats everyone else becomes even more important once the story shifts away from a hive mind on a distant planet and toward a much stranger, more layered kind of question, one that does not ask whether individual identity should be preserved or erased, but instead asks whether anyone, including Rick himself, could ever truly know if the world they are currently standing inside is even real to begin with. Section 07. The simulation. Rick already solved. A very old question sits underneath science fiction stories about fake worlds and hidden realities. How would anyone ever know for certain that the life they are living is actually real, rather than some elaborate illusion built to fool them completely? This question, sometimes called the simulation hypothesis, suggests that an advanced enough form of technology could create a fake version of reality so convincing that anyone trapped inside it would have no way of telling the difference between that fake world and the real one. Rick and Morty tackles this exact idea directly in one of its earliest episodes, wrapping a genuinely unsettling philosophical question inside a fast-paced parody of twist-ending movies. The episode is called Night Shame Aliens, a direct play on the name of a real film director known for building entire movies around a single, unexpected twist near the ending. In the episode, Rick, Morty, and Jerry find themselves trapped inside a fake version of their own everyday lives, created by a group of aliens called Zagarians. These aliens are running a scam, trying to trick Rick into revealing the secret formula behind something called concentrated dark matter, a substance that would allow their ships to travel through space far faster than they currently can. Rather than simply asking Rick directly for this information, which he would obviously refuse to give away for free, the Zygarians build an incredibly detailed fake version of Rick's own house, complete with a fake version of his family going about a completely ordinary day, hoping he will let his guard down and reveal the formula without realizing anyone is watching or listening. At first, everything inside this fake world looks convincing enough to fool an ordinary person completely. Morty wakes up, comments on the nice weather, and heads off toward what looks like his usual school routine. A robotic version of Beth drives off to work exactly the way she normally would on any regular morning. Jerry spends much of his time inside this fake world, completely oblivious to anything strange happening around him, focused instead on pitching a marketing slogan for apples to people who do not actually exist outside of this constructed simulation. Rick, however, notices something is wrong almost immediately. Small details do not add up the way they should in a real, lived-in world. Certain moments feel repetitive or slightly off in ways an ordinary person might never consciously notice. Yet Rick's mind catches these inconsistencies right away, tipping him off that something about his current surroundings is not what it claims to be. Once Rick realizes the truth, he tells Morty directly that they are trapped inside a simulation built by aliens attempting to steal his research. What follows becomes a fast-moving chase through multiple layers of fake reality stacked on top of each other, each new layer looking slightly different from the one before it, each one controlled by yet another version of the aliens running this elaborate scheme from somewhere just outside whatever fake world Rick and Morty currently find themselves inside. Every time Rick and Morty think they have finally broken free into the real world, they discover instead that they have only broken into another simulated layer, sitting one level above the last one, forcing them to repeat the same basic escape process all over again. This structure alone raises an important question that sits at the heart of the entire simulation hypothesis as a serious idea, far beyond just this one episode. If a person cannot immediately tell whether their current reality is fake, and if escaping one fake reality only reveals another fake reality sitting on top of it, how could anyone, even someone as sharp and observant as Rick, ever feel completely confident they have actually reached the real, true version of the world at last? The episode plays this uncertainty for laughs, piling layer after layer of fake reality on top of each other in increasingly ridiculous ways. Yet the underlying question stays serious, even while the tone stays light and fast-paced. Eventually, in the final major reveal of the episode, it becomes clear that the version of Morty Rick has been working alongside through most of this escape attempt was never actually the real Morty at all. This particular Morty was itself part of the simulation from the very beginning, a fake character built into this fabricated world specifically to keep Rick calm and cooperative, while the real target of the entire scheme continued unfolding somewhere else. The real people being scammed the entire time were Rick and Jerry, not Rick and Morty, as the episode initially leads viewers to believe. This twist flips the entire structure of the episode on its head, revealing that even Rick, someone confident enough in his own ability to detect fake surroundings that he moved through multiple layers of simulation without much hesitation, had still been fooled about one important detail the entire time without realizing it. This detail matters enormously to the overall philosophical weight of the episode. Rick did not walk away from this experience with total, flawless understanding of everything happening around him. He successfully identified that he was trapped inside layers of fake reality, and he successfully pushed through those layers toward what eventually turned out to be the true version of events. Yet he still missed one significant piece of the puzzle along the way, mistakenly trusting a character who turned out to be just as fake as the simulated house and simulated school he had already correctly identified as illusions. Even someone widely regarded, both inside the show and by its audience, as the smartest character in the entire series still operated with incomplete information for a meaningful stretch of the story, discovering the full truth only at the very last possible moment. Rick's final move in the episode reveals something important about how he chooses to respond once he finally understands the true situation surrounding him. Rather than panicking or continuing to search endlessly for some deeper, more hidden layer of reality that might still be lurking underneath everything he has already uncovered, Rick decides to act decisively based on the best information currently available to him. He deliberately gives the Zagarians a fake version of the dark matter formula, one specifically designed to cause an explosion rather than actually work the way they expect it to. This fake formula destroys the aliens attempting to scam him, bringing the entire elaborate scheme to an abrupt, violent end. Rick does not wait around, hoping for some future moment of perfect, complete certainty about everything happening around him. He uses the knowledge he currently has, incomplete as it might be, and commits fully to a decisive course of action based on that knowledge. This response says something important about how Rick actually operates when faced with genuine uncertainty about what is real and what is fake, a question that connects directly back to broader themes explored throughout earlier sections of this video. Rick does not require absolute, perfect certainty about the nature of reality before he is willing to act within it. He gathers what information he can, remains alert to signs that something around him might not be exactly what it claims to be, and then moves forward decisively once he has enough confidence in his own read of the situation, even knowing that read might still be missing something important hiding just outside his current view. This approach mirrors, in a strange way, the kind of response Camus argued a person should adopt once they accept that the universe will never hand them a fully satisfying, complete explanation of anything. Rather than freezing in place waiting for certainty that will likely never arrive, a person can still choose to act meaningfully within whatever partial understanding they currently hold. The episode does not end once the Zagarians are destroyed and Rick, Morty, and Jerry return safely to their actual, real lives. A short scene after the episode's ending credits complicates the sense of relief and resolution that might otherwise settle over the story. Late that same night, a visibly drunk Rick enters Morty's bedroom while Morty is asleep, holding a knife and demanding to know, with real, unsettling intensity, whether Morty is once again just another simulation, rather than the actual, real version of his grandson. Morty, terrified and confused by this sudden confrontation, reacts with genuine, unmistakable fear, convincing Rick that this version of Morty is finally the real one after all. Rick apologizes and passes out shortly afterward, ending the scene on a strange, uneasy note rather than a clean, comfortable conclusion. This small final scene reveals that Rick's confidence in his own ability to detect fake reality, so clearly on display throughout the main story of the episode, does not actually leave him feeling secure once the adventure officially ends. Instead of moving on calmly, trusting that his ordinary life has safely returned to normal, Rick remains genuinely paranoid enough to threaten his own sleeping grandson with a weapon, driven by real uncertainty about whether the version of Morty standing in front of him might still be fake. This detail undercuts any sense that Rick walked away from this experience with full, restored confidence in his own perception of reality. If anything, this experience seems to have deepened his uncertainty rather than resolving it, leaving him suspicious of even the most familiar, ordinary parts of his own daily life long after the actual danger has already passed. This contrast between Rick's confident, decisive actions during the main story and his private, drunken paranoia once the story officially ends adds an important layer to everything explored about his character across this video so far. Rick is capable of acting with total confidence and total decisiveness in the moment, correctly identifying fake layers of reality, outsmarting the aliens attempting to deceive him, and destroying the entire scheme through a clever, well-timed trick. Yet underneath that confident, decisive exterior, something clearly remains unsettled, something that surfaces only once the adrenaline of the main crisis has faded and Rick is left alone with his own thoughts late at night. This pattern echoes a detail already explored in earlier sections of this video, particularly the version of Rick shown avoiding vulnerability in Pickle Rick, using confidence and cleverness in the moment as a way of pushing through problems he does not not actually feel fully settled about deep down. There is also an important detail worth clarifying about how far this episode's ideas about fake reality actually extend, since online discussion about this particular episode sometimes stretches its themes further than the show itself directly confirms. A popular fan theory built around this episode suggests that Rick and Jerry, even after defeating the Zagarians and returning home, might still be trapped inside another layer of simulation that was never actually resolved by the end of the episode itself. This idea is worth mentioning honestly as exactly what it is: a theory built by fans, analyzing the episode's structure and drawing their own conclusions, rather than something the show itself directly states or confirms anywhere in its actual dialogue or plot. The confirmed canon reveal within the episode itself is limited specifically to Morty being revealed as part of the simulation, with Rick successfully identifying and destroying the real threat behind it. Whether some deeper, unresolved layer of fake reality still exists beyond that point remains speculation rather than anything the show has ever directly confirmed. This distinction matters for keeping the philosophical reading of this episode grounded firmly in what actually happens on screen, rather than drifting into open-ended speculation that the show itself never actually supports. What the episode does clearly and directly establish is enough on its own to raise serious, settling questions about the limits of anyone's ability to fully verify their own reality, even someone as intelligent and observant as Rick. He successfully detects layers of fake reality that would fool almost anyone else instantly, yet he still misses an important detail hiding in plain sight for a significant stretch of the story, and he still walks away from the entire experience carrying enough lingering doubt to threaten his own sleeping grandson with a weapon later that same night. That combination of confident competence and lingering uncertainty tells its own complete story without needing any additional fan speculation stretched on top of it. Placed next to everything already explored across this video so far, this episode adds an important new dimension to understanding how Rick actually operates underneath his constant claims about nihilism and meaninglessness. Rick does not simply declare that nothing matters and stop thinking any further about the nature of his own reality. He actively investigates, questions, and tests the world directly around him whenever something feels slightly off, refusing to simply accept his surroundings at face value the way Jerry does throughout this same episode, pitching Apple slogans to people who do not even actually exist without ever noticing anything strange happening around him. This active, searching approach to understanding his own reality suggests that Rick cares far more about accurately understanding the world he lives in than his stated nihilism would ever openly admit. A person who truly believed nothing mattered would have little reason to work so hard, identifying fake layers of reality stacked on top of each other, or to remain paranoid enough afterward to question whether even his own family might still be part of some larger, unresolved illusion. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same restless, searching instinct, the drive to keep questioning and testing reality, rather than simply accepting whatever answer feels most comfortable, becomes even more important once the story shifts away from alien scam artists and fake simulated houses, moving instead toward a very different kind of test, built entirely around Rick's own exact copies, spread across an enormous, tightly organized society made up of nothing but different versions of himself and his grandson. Section 08, The Citadel and the Politics of Being Replaceable. Every question explored across this video so far has focused on individual choices Rick makes in his own personal life, whether protecting his family, escaping fake simulations, or reacting to a hive mind that erases individuality across an entire planet. This next episode takes a completely different approach, stepping away from Rick and Morty as individual main characters entirely, and instead building an entire story out of countless other versions of the two of them, living inside a massive, structured society made up of nothing but copies of the same two people. This society is called the Citadel of Ricks, and it exists because of a basic fact already established earlier in this video. The multiverse contains infinite versions of Rick Sanchez and infinite versions of Morty Smith, spread across countless different dimensions. At some point, a large number of these different Ricks came together and built an enormous shared home base, a place where different versions of Rick and different versions of Morty could live safely without constantly running into danger across the wider multiverse. Over time, this settlement grew into something far bigger and far more complicated than a simple safe haven. It became a fully functioning society, complete with its own government, its own economy, its own police force, its own schools, and its own strict social hierarchy separating different versions of the exact same two people into different classes based on how capable, successful, or useful each individual copy happened to be. The episode exploring this society in the most detail is called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, and it takes an unusual approach right from the start. Rather than following the main Rick and Morty audiences have been watching throughout the rest of the series, the episode instead follows a rotating cast of entirely different Ricks and Mortys, all living out separate storylines within the Citadel at the exact same time. This structure alone makes an important point before the episode even reaches its major reveals. If Rick and Morty are supposed to be interchangeable with countless other versions of themselves, as Rick himself has suggested more more than once throughout this video, then a story built entirely around different Ricks and different Mortys should still feel recognizably like a Rick and Morty story, even without the two specific characters audiences have grown attached to appearing anywhere in it. One of the most important storylines inside this episode follows a version of Morty attending something called Morty Academy, a school built specifically to train young Mortys before they are eventually assigned to a Rick who will take them on adventures across the wider multiverse. A group of students at this school, led by a rebellious Morty nicknamed Slick, grow frustrated with the idea that their entire lives are structured around eventually serving whichever Rick they get assigned to, rather than building any kind of independent future of their own. They hear rumors of a mythical wishing portal, supposedly capable of granting any wish a person throws themselves into, and they set out together to find it, hoping to escape the rigid, predetermined path already laid out for every Morty living inside the Citadel. When they finally reach the portal, each student except Slick immediately jumps in, apparently trusting that their wishes will simply come true once they do. Slick hesitates, wishing instead for real, lasting change for Mortys everywhere, before finally throwing himself into the portal as well. The portal, it turns out, is not magical at all. It is simply a trash disposal chute, and the students who jumped into it before Slick are never shown again, strongly suggesting they met a grim, permanent end rather than any kind of magical wish fulfillment. This storyline delivers one of the darkest, bluntest points made anywhere in the episode. Even the youngest, most hopeful Mortys living inside this heavily structured society, the ones who have not yet been worn down by years of serving under a Rick, are still vulnerable to exploitation and tragedy, manipulated by false promises of escape that lead nowhere except toward their own destruction. A second major storyline follows a Rick working an ordinary factory job, producing a product called Simple Rick's Wafers, a snack food flavored using neurochemicals extracted from the memories of a captured, docile Rick known simply as Simple Rick. This detail alone raises an unsettling question about how far the Citadel's economy is willing to go in exploiting different versions of Rick for profit, treating one particular Rick's captured memories as nothing more than raw material for a mass-produced snack sold to other Ricks throughout the Citadel. The factory worker Rick, central to this storyline, identified by the designation Rick J22, becomes furious after being passed over for a promotion he clearly believes he deserves. His anger builds until he violently destroys his own assembly machine and kills his former supervisor, eventually taking the captive Simple Rick hostage in a desperate, dangerous bid to escape his own dead-end life working inside this exploitative factory system. This storyline lands with particular weight once placed against everything already established about Rick Sanchez throughout the rest of this video. The main Rick audiences have followed across nearly every other episode discussed so far is consistently shown as brilliant, resourceful, and capable of solving nearly any problem through sheer scientific ingenuity. Rick J22 is still, genetically and technically, the exact same person, carrying the exact same baseline intelligence and the exact same fundamental identity as every other version of Rick shown throughout the series. Yet this particular version of Rick has spent years trapped inside a menial, repetitive factory job, his obvious intelligence wasted on a task that barely requires it, denied even the basic promotion that might offer him some small improvement to his circumstances. If intelligence and capability alone were enough to guarantee a good, meaningful life, every Rick throughout the Citadel should theoretically enjoy roughly similar success and similar opportunities. Instead, the Citadel's economy and social structure clearly produce enormous inequality even among people who are, on a fundamental level, exactly identical to each other. A third storyline follows a very different kind of Morty, one working as a police officer alongside other Morty cops, tasked specifically with maintaining order across the poorer, more dangerous parts of the Citadel, an area referred to as Morty Town. This officer, along with his partner, patrols streets filled with struggling, impoverished Mortys, treating them with open contempt and casual cruelty, despite technically being made of the exact same basic template as the very people he is mistreating. At one point, this officer casually mentions that Mortys living in Morty Town grow up without any real families of their own, existing instead purely to eventually be assigned to whichever Rick happens to need one. This detail, delivered almost as a passing remark within the episode itself, gains a much darker and more literal meaning years later, once a much later season of the show reveals that Mortys really are mass-produced, given implanted memories of a fake childhood, and distributed to Ricks who need a replacement, often standing in for a previous Morty who has already died or gone missing. This later confirmation transforms what originally sounded like biting social commentary about how poorer Mortys are treated into something far more literal and disturbing. The entire Morty population throughout the multiverse, not just the specific struggling Mortys shown living inside Morty Town, exists as a manufactured, replaceable class of beings, produced specifically to serve whichever Rick happens to need a companion at any given moment. This detail connects directly back to ideas already explored much earlier in this video, particularly Rick's repeated tendency to treat individual lives, individual realities, and individual relationships as fundamentally replaceable whenever convenient. The Citadel simply takes that same underlying assumption and builds builds an entire functioning society directly on top of it, formalizing the idea that Mortis exists primarily to serve Ricks into an actual, structured economic and social system, rather than leaving it as an occasional personal choice made by one specific Rick in one specific moment. The final and most consequential storyline running throughout the episode follows the Citadel's ongoing presidential election, a process that appears, at least on the surface, to function like an ordinary democracy. Two different candidates campaign actively for the position, each promising different policy approaches to running the Citadel going forward. One candidate campaigns on expanding social programs and increasing support for struggling members of Citadel society, similar to progressive political platforms found in real-world democracies. The other candidate campaigns on prioritizing jobs and public safety, similar to more conservative political platforms found in real-world elections as well. On the surface, this setup suggests genuine political choice and genuine competition between different visions for how the Citadel should be governed going forward. The episode gradually reveals that this appearance of democratic choice is largely an illusion, carefully maintained by a small, extremely powerful group known as the Shadow Council, made up of some of the most capable and influential Ricks living inside the Citadel. Rather than allowing genuine competition for real political power, this Shadow Council works quietly behind the scenes to ensure that whichever candidate wins the election remains ultimately controllable, protecting their own continued influence and authority regardless of which specific candidate officially holds the title of president at any given time. Elections happen, votes get counted, and the appearance of choice remains intact for ordinary citizens throughout the Citadel, yet the actual distribution of meaningful power stays concentrated among this small, unelected group, operating with far less visibility and far less accountability than the elected officials technically representing the population. The episode's final twist disrupts even this carefully managed illusion of controlled democracy. The winning candidate in this particular election turns out to be a Morty rather than a Rick, breaking from what had apparently been the Citadel's usual pattern of Rick-led leadership up to this point. This detail alone represents a significant disruption to the established order, since the entire structure of the Citadel, from its factories to its police force to its schools, has consistently placed Ricks in positions of authority over Mortys throughout every other storyline explored across the episode. A Morty winning the highest position of power inside this entire society suggests the possibility of real, meaningful change finally breaking through the Shadow Council's carefully managed system. This hope collapses almost immediately once the newly elected Morty is revealed to be a character already familiar to longtime viewers of the series, one who had first appeared much earlier during the finale of the show's very first season. This particular Morty, commonly referred to by fans as Evil Morty due to his cold, calculating nature, wastes no time consolidating complete personal control once he officially takes power. He orders the execution of dissenting Ricks from within the very Shadow Council that believed it had successfully maintained quiet control over the election process, ejecting their bodies into space rather than allowing them any opportunity to interfere with whatever plans he has for his newly acquired power. Rather than genuinely representing the interests of struggling, impoverished Mortys throughout the Citadel, as his campaign promises might have suggested, Evil Morty appears far more interested in personally seizing control of the entire system, for reasons that remain deliberately unclear by the end of the episode itself. This ending delivers one of the sharpest, most cynical political statements found anywhere across the entire series. The Citadel's democracy, already exposed as largely controlled and manipulated behind the scenes by the Shadow Council, does not actually get fixed or improved once a genuine outsider manages to break through that manipulation and win real power. Instead, that outsider simply replaces one form of concentrated, unaccountable control with another, using violence and intimidation to secure his own position, rather than genuinely working to improve conditions for the struggling population he supposedly represents. The episode does not offer any clean, hopeful resolution, suggesting that real change has finally arrived inside the Citadel. It instead suggests that concentrated power, once established inside a system already built around hierarchy and control, tends to simply shift from one ambitious individual to another, regardless of what promises get made along the way, to whoever happens to be voting. This entire episode gains additional weight once placed alongside everything already explored throughout this video about Rick's own personal philosophy and his own personal choices. The Citadel represents, in a very real sense, an entire society built directly around the same basic assumptions Rick himself has repeatedly demonstrated through his individual actions throughout the series. Individual lives, individual identities, and individual relationships are treated as fundamentally replaceable whenever convenient, whether that means abandoning an entire ruined reality for a nearly identical replacement, mass-producing Mortys to serve whichever Rick happens to need one, or manipulating an entire population's vote to protect the interests of a small, powerful group operating behind the scenes. The Citadel simply formalizes these same basic assumptions into official policy, government structure, and economic practice, rather than leaving them as personal choices made by individual Ricks acting on their own throughout the wider multiverse. At the same time, the episode reveals genuine cracks and tensions running through throughout this system, ones that suggest even a society built entirely around interchangeable copies of the same two people cannot fully escape questions about fairness, exploitation, and the value of individual lives. Rick J22's violent breakdown after being denied a promotion he clearly deserved shows that even genetically identical copies of the same brilliant, capable person can end up trapped in dramatically unequal circumstances, undermining any assumption that identical starting points automatically produce identical or fair outcomes. The Morty Academy students' tragic fate inside the fake wishing portal shows that even the youngest, most hopeful members of this society remain vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation by those holding more power over them. Evil Morty's violent seizure of control after winning the presidency shows that even genuine disruption to an unfair, manipulated system does not automatically produce anything better once that disruption succeeds, since the person seizing new power may simply have their own separate, equally troubling agenda to pursue instead. None of these storylines feature the specific Rick and Morty audiences have followed throughout the rest of the series, yet all of them clearly grow out of the exact same underlying world and the exact same underlying assumptions about identity, value, and replaceability already established through that main Rick and Morty's individual choices and individual adventures. This connection matters because it suggests the questions raised throughout earlier sections of this video about whether Rick genuinely believes individual lives carry any lasting weight extend far beyond just his own personal choices and his own personal relationships. They appear to reflect something closer to a fundamental, structural truth about how the entire multiverse operates whenever enough different versions of the same basic template exist side by side, whether that template happens to be Rick, Morty, or any other kind of person spread widely enough across enough different realities. This raises an important question that becomes especially difficult once turned back toward Rick specifically, rather than toward the wider Citadel society explored throughout this particular episode. If an entire society built around countless different versions of Rick and Morty inevitably produces this kind of exploitation, inequality, and quiet violence once enough time and enough structure gets built around it, then the specific personal choices made by the one particular Rick this video has followed most closely start to look less like unique personal decisions and more like small, individual expressions of something much larger and more troubling, built directly into how his entire species of infinite copies tends to organize itself whenever given enough time and enough opportunity to do so. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding why any single version of Rick, including the one at the center of this entire video, ended up shaped this particular way in the first place, requires looking much further back than any of the episodes explored so far, past the jokes about dipping sauces and fake simulations, back toward the specific, painful moment that first pushed this particular Rick toward building his entire identity around portals, revenge, and a deep, guarded resistance to ever fully trusting stability again. Section 09. The grief behind the genius. A single, quiet decision, made decades before any of the events explored throughout this video actually happened, created the version of Rick Sanchez everyone has been examining across the previous 8 sections. That decision belonged to a much younger Rick, still working as a scientist trying to solve the technical problem of traveling between dimensions, long before he ever became the hardened, unpredictable figure fans grew to know through the series. Understanding what happened to him during this period explains far more about his stated nihilism, his sudden bursts of protective violence, and his deep resistance to emotional vulnerability than any single episode analyzed so far has managed to reveal on its own. This backstory first appears during the Season 3 premiere, an episode already discussed earlier in this video for its Szechuan sauce storyline, called the Rick Shank Rickdemption. While imprisoned by the Galactic Federation, Rick is subjected to a mind probe carried out by an agent named Cornelius Daniel, who attempts to extract the secret formula behind Rick's portal gun by digging directly through Rick's own memories. Inside this memory, viewers see a much younger Rick struggling with the technical challenge of building working interdimensional travel technology. A different, more experienced Rick approaches him during this period, encouraging him to abandon his current path and join a wider group of Ricks who already travel freely between dimensions. The younger Rick, seemingly content with his current family life alongside his wife Diane and young daughter Beth, declines this offer, choosing to stay close to his family rather than pursue that alternate path. The other Rick reacts to this rejection with anger, apparently insulted that his offer was refused. In retaliation, he detonates a bomb at Rick's home, killing both Diane and young Beth. This tragedy becomes the turning point, pushing Rick toward finally inventing his own working portal gun, driven now not by simple scientific curiosity, but by a devastating personal loss and a burning need to track down and confront the Rick responsible for it. Once Rick reveals this memory to his Galactic Federation interrogators, he immediately claims that the entire memory was completely fabricated, a deliberate lie meant to throw off anyone trying to extract real information from his mind. For a long stretch of the show's run, this left the true nature of Rick's backstory deliberately unclear, with fans uncertain whether they had just witnessed real personal history or an elaborate piece of misdirection invented implanted specifically to protect Rick's real secrets. Later seasons of the show gradually confirmed that this memory, despite Rick's own claim that it was fabricated, was actually true in nearly every important detail. Episodes including Rick Ternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort and Rick Mirai Jack, both from later seasons, filled in the remaining pieces of this story, confirming that Diane and Beth really were killed in an explosion caused by another version of Rick, later identified specifically as Rick Prime. The only part of the original memory that turned out to be inaccurate involved certain details about what happened immediately following the explosion itself, rather than the core tragedy driving the entire story. This confirmation transformed what many fans had assumed was simply a clever piece of misdirection into the actual emotional foundation underlying Rick's entire personality and his entire approach to the world throughout the series. This detail changes the meaning of nearly everything explored earlier throughout this video. Rick's stated nihilism, his casual willingness to treat different realities and different versions of people as replaceable, and his deep resistance to emotional vulnerability all begin to look less like a settled personal philosophy chosen through calm, rational reflection, and more like a direct psychological response to catastrophic sudden loss. A man who once tried to build a quiet, stable family life, only to have that life violently destroyed because of a decision he made to prioritize that same family over further scientific ambition, has an obvious, painful reason to become deeply suspicious of stability, deeply guarded against emotional attachment, and deeply committed to the idea that nothing should ever be allowed to matter enough to hurt this badly again. Rick's response to this loss did not end with simple grief. According to details revealed in an episode called Solarix, Rick eventually built an artificial intelligence version of Diane, designed specifically to exist inside his old, abandoned house back in his original home dimension. This AI version of Diane speaks to Rick as though calling out to him from another room, constantly reminding him of his failure to protect her, and repeatedly urging him to pursue revenge against the Rick responsible for killing her and Beth. Rather than seeking comfort or closure through this creation, Rick appears to have built a device specifically designed to keep his grief and his need for revenge alive and active, refusing to let either fade naturally over time, the way most people eventually process painful loss. This detail suggests something deeply important about how Rick chooses to relate to his own trauma. Rather than working through it or finding ways to heal from it, he built external tools specifically designed to preserve it, keeping the wound open rather than allowing it to close. The identity of the Rick responsible for this tragedy eventually becomes one of the most important pieces of the show's overall mythology. Referred to across the series simply as Rick Prime, this particular version of Rick turns out to be responsible for killing not just one version of Diane and Beth, but multiple versions of Diane across different dimensions entirely. As other Ricks throughout the wider multiverse begin hunting Rick Prime for what he did to their own versions of Diane, Rick Prime responds by building an elaborate device called the Omega device, specifically designed to eliminate the version of Diane connected to any Rick who might come looking for revenge against him. This detail reveals that the personal tragedy driving the main Rick of this video is not actually unique to him specifically. It appears to be part of a much wider pattern of violence carried out by one especially ruthless version of Rick against countless other versions of the same basic family structure, spread out across the entire multiverse. Rick Prime's continued efforts to protect himself from the growing number of Ricks hunting him down eventually included building a trap specifically designed using the image of Diane herself. According to details revealed later in the series, Rick Prime constructed an elaborate, dangerous trap incorporating a combat robot built to resemble Diane's face, using this disturbing setup as a final defense against Ricks who managed to track him down seeking justice for what he took from them. This detail adds a particularly dark, cruel dimension to Rick Prime's character, suggesting a level of calculated cruelty that goes beyond simply causing harm and extends into deliberately weaponizing the very image of the loss he caused against the people seeking justice for it. This ongoing search for Rick Prime shapes much of what happens to the specific Rick followed throughout the main series, including major events explored earlier in this video, such as his role in founding the Council of Ricks and helping establish the initial construction of the Citadel, discussed during the previous section. According to details established across the show, Rick eventually helped bring together enough different Ricks to overwhelm and temporarily contain the wider threat Rick Prime represented, leading directly to the formation of organized Rick society inside the Citadel. Rick reportedly left before this project was fully completed, suggesting he remained more interested in his personal pursuit of Rick Prime than in staying behind to help manage or govern the wider Rick community once its basic structure had been established. One of the most significant details revealed about this backstory involves where Rick eventually settled after Diane and Beth's deaths, and how this decision connects directly to the specific family audiences have followed throughout the entire series. According to the show's confirmed mythology, Rick eventually traveled specifically to Rick Prime's own original home dimension, taking the place of that dimension's father figure after Rick Prime had long since abandoned his own family there. This means the Beth, and by extension the Summer, Morty, and Jerry that audiences have followed throughout every episode of the series, are not actually part of the original family Rick lost in the explosion that killed Diane and young Beth. They belong instead to a completely different family, one originally connected to Rick Prime rather than to Rick himself, which Rick chose to join and remain part of after his own original family was taken from him. This detail transforms the emotional weight behind Rick's fierce, repeated protectiveness toward this specific family, a pattern already explored extensively throughout earlier sections of this video. Rick's willingness to sacrifice himself in the wedding squanchers, his elaborate emotional avoidance in Pickle Rick, and his consistent pattern of showing up whenever this family faces genuine danger all take on a deeper meaning once placed alongside this backstory. Rick is not simply protecting his own biological family, the way most people naturally might. He is protecting a family he specifically chose to join after losing his original one, adopting Rick Prime's abandoned wife and children as his own, rather than continuing to search endlessly for some replacement version of Diane and Beth specifically. This choice suggests something significant about how Rick actually processes his grief, even while refusing to discuss it openly or acknowledge it directly through most of the series. Rather than isolating himself completely, or refusing ever again to risk emotional attachment, Rick ultimately chose to build a new version of family life anyway, even while continuing to pursue Rick Prime, and even while maintaining an artificial version of Diane, specifically designed to keep his original grief alive back in his abandoned home dimension. The eventual resolution of Rick's long pursuit of Rick Prime finally arrives through events revealed across later seasons of the show, where Rick manages to track down and kill Rick Prime through an alliance formed with Evil Morty, the same character introduced earlier in this video during the discussion of the Citadel's political structure. This alliance itself represents a striking, unexpected choice, given that Evil Morty had previously been established as a dangerous, manipulative figure willing to seize violent control over the entire Citadel purely for his own personal reasons. Rick's willingness to work alongside someone this dangerous, purely to finally secure the specific revenge he has spent years pursuing, reveals just how deeply this particular loss continued driving his choices, even decades after Diane and Beth were originally killed. This extended, multi-season backstory adds crucial context to nearly every philosophical reading of Rick explored throughout the earlier sections of this video. His stated nihilism, examined through disasters like Rick Potion Number 9 and creations like Abradolf Linkler, looks less like a philosophy Rick arrived at through calm intellectual reasoning and much more like a defense mechanism built directly on top of catastrophic personal loss. His absurdist persistence, chasing a discontinued dipping sauce with the same intensity most people reserve for genuinely important goals, looks less like pure comic randomness and more like a way of channeling enormous, restless energy into something small and safe, rather than confronting the much larger, more painful questions still sitting underneath his daily life. His existentialist protectiveness toward his specific family, demonstrated through sacrifice and avoidance in roughly equal measure, looks less like a settled personal value and more like a direct, ongoing response to having already lost one family and refusing, on some deep level, to lose another one the same way. Even his willingness to remain unbothered by Unity's total erasure of individual identity across an entire planet gains new context once placed alongside this backstory. A man who has already lost one version of the specific individual identity and family structure he once valued most might reasonably develop a more detached, less protective attitude toward individuality and personal identity in general, reserving his genuine investment specifically for the small number of people he has personally chosen to rebuild that structure around, rather than extending that same concern automatically toward strangers he encounters throughout the wider multiverse. This backstory does not excuse or erase any of the troubling behavior explored throughout earlier sections of this video. Rick still abandoned an entire ruined reality without much visible remorse. He still created a suffering, confused life purely as an experiment, then dismissed that life's pain once the experiment failed. He still remained largely unbothered by an entire population losing its individual freedom to Unity's collective control. Understanding where his worldview originated does not mean these choices suddenly become acceptable or justified. It simply means these choices no longer look like they emerge from a coldly rational, carefully reasoned philosophy adopted through calm reflection. They look instead like the ongoing, imperfect fallout of a devastating loss Rick has never fully processed, one he continues managing through avoidance, distraction, and carefully controlled emotional distance rather than genuine healing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises a final question, hard to avoid once all this evidence sits side by side. If Rick's nihilism traces back to grief rather than genuine conviction, and his protectiveness toward his family reveals a man quietly building meaning despite his own words, then the real question is not which label fits Rick best. It becomes whether Rick has already started changing, whether the man seen most recently on the show still matches the guarded figure from its earliest episodes, or whether something underneath that hardened exterior has already begun to shift. Section 10. Did Rick ever believe his own philosophy? 9 different episodes across 9 different sections have now been placed under close examination, each one testing a different piece of what Rick Sanchez claims to believe about about the universe against what he actually does when the pressure is real. The pattern that emerges from stacking all of these examples together is not simple, and it does not resolve into one clean, satisfying answer. What it does offer is enough evidence to finally take a real position on the question this whole video was built around from the very beginning. Start with the plainest, most direct piece of evidence available. The moment Rick finally achieves the one goal that has quietly driven nearly everything about his personality since Diane and Beth were killed decades earlier. In the 5th episode of the show's 7th season, an episode called Unmortrican, Rick finally catches up to Rick Prime, the specific version of himself responsible for that original bombing, aided by an unexpected alliance with evil Morty. After years of searching, after founding the Citadel, after building an artificial version of Diane, specifically to keep his grief and his need for revenge burning, Rick finally gets the chance to kill the man who took his original family away from him. He takes it. Rick beats Rick Prime to death in a brutal extended confrontation that critics covering the episode described as one of the most significant turning points in the entire history of the series. If Rick's nihilism were genuinely settled and complete, this moment should have felt like nothing more than another disposable event in an indifferent universe. No more meaningful than any of the countless other disasters, deaths, and destroyed realities scattered across 9 seasons of adventures. Instead, multiple critics who watched this episode closely described Rick's reaction to finally killing Rick Prime as shaken rather than triumphant, numb rather than satisfied. A person who has just achieved the single goal defining decades of his entire life should feel something. Rick's reaction suggests he did feel something, just not the clean, victorious relief that revenge stories usually promise. This detail matters enormously. A committed nihilist should not be shaken by finally closing the book on his life's defining trauma. Someone who has spent this much energy avoiding admitting that anything matters to him would have every reason to feel unsettled once that pursuit finally ends, because its ending forces him to confront exactly how much weight he had actually been carrying the entire time, whether he wanted to admit it or not. The seasons following Rick Prime's death only deepen this picture, rather than resolving it neatly. According to critics who covered Season 7 closely, Rick spent much of the remaining episodes struggling with a new kind of problem entirely, one that had nothing to do with fighting enemies or solving scientific puzzles. He had to figure out who he actually was once his defining mission had finally been completed. For years, tracking down Rick Prime gave every one of his choices a clear, unifying purpose underneath all the noise and distraction of dipping sauces and simulated realities. Once that purpose disappeared, Rick appeared to drift, sometimes looking healed and settled, other times looking lost and uncertain about what should come next. This kind of prolonged struggle to define a new sense of purpose is not something a person experiences if they genuinely believe nothing in life carries any weight to begin with. It is something a person experiences when they have quietly built their entire identity around one specific goal, only to discover that achieving it does not automatically answer the much harder question of what to care about next. The clearest, most direct piece of evidence supporting real change in Rick's character arrives in the season's finale, an episode called Fear No Mort. In this episode, Rick and Morty encounter a strange, otherworldly space called the Hole, a location that offers anyone who enters it the chance to fully experience whatever they fear most, supposedly as a way of finally overcoming that fear once and for all. Rick, given the opportunity to face his own deepest fear, is confronted with something remarkable. Entering the Hole would give him the chance to reunite with a version of Diane, the wife he lost so many years earlier, the loss that originally set his entire life on the path explored throughout this video. Rick chooses not to go in. He deliberately turns away from the opportunity to reunite with Diane, even knowing what that reunion might offer him, because doing so would mean abandoning the actual, imperfect life he has built for himself since her death. The life built around Beth, Summer, Morty, and Jerry, rather than around chasing a version of his original family back from the dead. This single choice carries enormous weight, once placed against everything explored throughout this entire video. A nihilist, someone who genuinely believes nothing in the universe carries any lasting value, would have no strong reason to reject an opportunity like this one. If nothing truly matters, choosing between 2 different lives, 2 different families, or 2 different versions of happiness should be an empty decision, since neither option would carry any real weight over the other. Rick's choice suggests something completely different. He values the specific, imperfect life he has actually built enough to walk away from a tempting alternative that might have offered him something closer to his original loss undone. That is not indifference. That is someone actively choosing one specific version of meaning over another. Precisely the kind of decision existentialism describes when it argues that people build their own personal values through the choices they actually make, rather than waiting for the universe to hand them an objective answer about what should matter most. Critics covering this same finale noted something else worth taking seriously here. Throughout the season leading up to this moment, audiences had already been shown a version of Rick who had become noticeably more affectionate, more vulnerable, and less openly hostile compared to the guarded, sharp-edged character introduced across the earliest seasons of the show. This detail matters because it did not happen in one single dramatic moment. It built up gradually, episode by episode, suggesting real, gradual, sustained change, rather than a single convenient plot twist inserted purely for emotional effect. The tragedy noted by critics covering this same finale is that Morty, still trapped inside his own personal fears throughout most of the episode, never actually witnesses this growth clearly enough to fully register it, leaving him uncertain about his own place in Rick's life, even while Rick himself has quietly become a warmer, more present version of the man Morty grew up following into danger. This detail closely mirrors something discussed much earlier in this video, back in the section examining Rick's elaborate avoidance of family therapy in Pickle Rick. Rick's growth throughout Season 7 follows the same basic pattern already visible in that much earlier episode. He does not announce his own emotional change directly, and he does not sit down and openly explain to Morty that something inside him has shifted. He simply behaves differently, gradually, in ways that require close attention to actually notice. This consistency across so many seasons suggests that Rick's resistance to openly acknowledging his own emotional growth is not a contradiction undermining that growth. It is simply part of how this particular character has always processed change, quietly and indirectly, through action rather than through direct confession. Taken together, all of this evidence points toward a specific, defensible answer to the question sitting at the center of this entire video. Rick Sanchez never fully lived according to the nihilism he claimed to believe throughout the earliest years of the show, and by the time the story reaches its more recent seasons, he appears to be moving even further away from that original stance, whether he ever admits this shift out loud or not. His declared nihilism, examined through disasters like Rick Potion No. 9 and creations like Aberdolf Linkler, always sat uneasily alongside his repeated willingness to sacrifice himself for his family, his elaborate efforts to avoid confronting his own emotional attachments, and his restless, active refusal to simply accept fake or uncertain versions of his own reality without a fight. Once his defining source of grief and vengeance was finally resolved through Rick Prime's death, that underlying tension did not disappear. It became impossible to ignore, forcing Rick into a genuine, visible struggle to figure out what should matter to him now that revenge no longer offered an easy, all-consuming answer. None of this means Rick transformed into a fundamentally different person, free of everything explored throughout the earlier sections of this video. He still shows moments of the same detachment, the same willingness to treat certain lives and certain outcomes as less important than others, the same tendency to avoid direct emotional honesty whenever possible. Growth, in Rick's case, does not look like a clean, permanent transformation from one fixed identity into another. It looks like a slow, uneven shift, visible mostly through small, specific choices made under real pressure, like turning away from the whole rather than through any grand, dramatic speech explaining exactly how he has changed and why. This uneven, inconsistent version of growth actually fits the overall philosophical picture built throughout this entire video better than a clean, total transformation ever could. Nihilism, absurdism, and existentialism were never meant to describe separate, mutually exclusive categories that a person either fully belongs to or fully avoids. They describe different possible responses to the exact same basic problem, the problem of living inside a universe that refuses to hand out clear, guaranteed meaning. Rick has spent the entire series moving between these different responses depending on the specific situation directly in front of him, sometimes leaning toward pure detachment, sometimes leaning toward stubborn persistence, and sometimes, especially where his specific chosen family is concerned, leaning toward genuine, personally constructed meaning he refuses to admit out loud even while acting on it decisively. The smartest man in the universe, then, was never actually a settled nihilist in the deepest, most consistent sense of that word. He was something closer to a deeply wounded man who built nihilism as a shield, wielding it loudly and constantly enough to convince both himself and everyone around him that nothing could ever hurt him again the way Diane and Beth's deaths once did. That shield never fully worked. Not completely, not across 9 seasons of consistent evidence showing him protecting, sacrificing for, and quietly growing more attached to the specific family he eventually chose to rebuild his life around. The gap between what Rick says and what Rick actually does was never a flaw in his character. It was always the entire point, the exact tension that pulled so many fans, writers, and thinkers into taking a cartoon scientist seriously enough to write entire books and academic essays trying to explain him. Whether Rick himself ever fully admits any of this out loud remains genuinely uncertain, and the show itself seems in no hurry to force that admission, clearly or permanently. What the evidence gathered across this entire video does confirm is that his actions have quietly told a different, more honest story than his words ever did, one built not around meaninglessness, but around a man who lost everything once, built something new anyway, and kept choosing, again and again, to protect it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.